Ever get sucked into one of those debates about God? You know, the ones that feel like they could go on forever.
Oh yeah, those are fun.
Well, buckle up because today's deep dive throws us right into the thick of it.
Can't wait. Who are our friendly neighborhood debaters?
We've got Ron, who believes in God, and in the other corner, we've got Dan, a self-proclaimed atheist.
Okay, so a classic showdown. What makes this one special?
These guys don't just scratch the surface, they go deep. And their first point of contention, how can a universe this complex with things like DNA just happen by chance?
The age-old question of design. It's like walking into a perfectly organized workshop, tools in place, gears turning. You wouldn't think it all just assembled itself, right?
Exactly. And Ron uses this analogy to talk about the complexity of life, especially something like DNA. He says it points to a creator, just like that organized workshop points to a skilled craftsman.
That's a classic argument, often called the argument from design. And it's pretty compelling. But of course, Dan has a counter.
Oh, I bet he does. What's his take?
Well, he basically says, just because we don't understand everything right now doesn't mean we never will. He's putting his faith in science to eventually fill in the blanks.
So instead of a divine creator, Dan's betting on science to solve the mysteries of the universe.
Exactly. He uses the example of lightning. For centuries, people explained it as the wrath of gods.
Makes sense, right? It's powerful, unpredictable.
Totally. But then science comes along and shows us it's just electrical discharge.
Okay, so no more Zeus throwing thunderbolts.
Not quite. But you get the idea. Dan argues that's what often happens with God. It's used to explain things until science finds a better answer.
Interesting. So every scientific discovery is like closing the door on a supernatural explanation.
In a way, yeah. And Dan even brings up the Big Bang Theory as an example.
Oh, right. That used to be a huge mystery.
It's like the ultimate unknown,
Yeah.
And some people definitely saw it as evidence for divine creator.
But now
Now we have a scientific model to explain it, at least in part. It's like science is slowly but surely painting a clearer picture of how the universe works.
But does that completely rule out the why questions? Like, even if we figure out how the universe began, does that tell us why it exists in the first place?
Good point. And that's where things get really interesting, because that's exactly what Ron digs into. He says, even if science explains how, it doesn't necessarily address the why. And for him, that's where faith steps in.
So he finds meaning in the idea of a creator, a purpose behind it all.
Exactly. He finds that idea really satisfying, even if he can't prove it scientifically.
But is that feeling enough? I mean, if you're someone who needs tangible evidence, is meaning enough to base your whole worldview on?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it really highlights the fundamental difference between these two perspectives. It's almost like they're speaking two different languages.
A language of faith versus a language of empirical evidence.
Precisely. And this difference plays out in another big topic. They tackle morality.
And just when I thought they couldn't get any deeper, Ron brings in some heavy hitters from Jewish thought.
Oh, yeah. Like who? The Kuzari, for one.
Okay, now we're talking serious philosophy. For those who haven't had the pleasure of diving into the Kuzari, what's Ron's point in bringing it up?
Well, he uses the Kuzari's argument about Mount Sinai. Think about it. Thousands of people witnessing miracles, receiving the Torah. Ron's point is that this kind of public, massive event makes the story way more believable, right?
He's arguing against the idea that it's just some made-up myth that got passed around.
Exactly. But you can always count on Dan to have a counterpoint ready.
What's his take? Does he buy the whole mass revelation thing?
Not really. He's basically saying, hey, people used to believe in all kinds of crazy stories, myths, legends, you name it. Right, like, remember when people thought the earth was flat? Or that the sun revolved around us?
Exactly. So Dan's argument is that just because a story gets passed down and people believe it, doesn't necessarily make it true.
Makes sense. So how do you separate fact from fiction? Especially when it comes to events that happened thousands of years ago.
Well, that's where Ron brings in another big name, Maimonides. But Maimonides' argument is a little more, shall we say, philosophical.
Hit me with it. I love a good philosophical brain teaser.
Okay, so get ready for this. Maimonides talks about the first cause. It's basically this idea that everything that exists had to have a cause, right?
Okay, following so far. Things don't just appear out of thin air, usually.
Right. So Maimonides says you keep tracing those causes back further and further until you reach a point where something must have started it all. And that something, that uncaused cause, that's God.
So he's saying there has to be some kind of starting point, something that wasn't caused by something else. Because if it was, you just keep going back and back forever.
Exactly. And for Maimonides, that ultimate starting point is what we call God.
That's a pretty heady concept.
Yeah.
But I've got to ask, how does Maimonides' take on this first cause idea differ from what other thinkers before him had said?
Well, it's not just that he's using this first cause argument, it's how he defines it. He goes deep into the nature of this first cause. For example, he says it can't be like anything we experience in the physical world. It has to be eternal, unchanging, something truly beyond our understanding.
So he's not just saying, hey, something had to start it all. He's trying to figure out the very nature of that starting point.
Precisely. And his ideas had a huge impact on Jewish thought. But let's get back to our debaters. As you might expect, Dan isn't easily swayed by a centuries-old argument.
So what's his counter to Maimonides' first cause?
This is where things get really interesting. Dan actually brings up quantum physics. He's talking about particles popping in and out of existence, stuff that seems to happen without a clear cause.
Wait, so we've gone from ancient Jewish scholars to the subatomic realm? This debate's got range.
Right. It's like they're covering the entire spectrum of human thought. But Dan's point is that maybe, just maybe, our whole understanding of cause and effect, of how the universe works at its most fundamental level, is wrong.
It's like he's saying, what if the universe isn't this neat, orderly system that we think it is? What if it's way more chaotic and unpredictable than we can even imagine?
Exactly. And what's even more mind-blowing is that quantum physics actually suggests that might be the case. So we've got all these mind-blowing ideas flying around. First cause, quantum physics, ancient philosophers. It's a lot. But then Ron brings up something a little more grounded, something that hits closer to home, especially in the Jewish tradition.
Okay, what's his next move?
He starts talking about the survival of the Jewish people.
Ah, that's a powerful one.
Right. Think about it. Centuries of exile, persecution, attempts to wipe them out completely. Yet, they persevered.
And he sees that as evidence of
Divine intervention. He's saying there's no way they could have survived all that without some kind of divine guidance, some higher power looking out for them.
It's definitely a compelling argument, especially for someone who sees history as being guided by a higher purpose.
Yeah, and it's not just about historical events. It taps into this deep-seated human need to believe that even when things are incredibly tough, there's a plan, that someone or something is in control.
Right, that even in the darkest of times, there's a reason for hope. But how does Dan respond to this? He's not usually one to be swayed by sentiment alone.
True. He acknowledges the weight of the argument, the emotional power behind it, but he still wants proof.
There it is again, that fundamental difference in their worldviews.
Exactly. For Ron, the experience itself, the feeling of being guided, of being part of something bigger that's evidence enough. But for Dan, it all comes back to tangible proof. He needs something measurable, observable, something that fits into his scientific understanding of the world.
So where does that leave them? After going head-to-head on the Big Bang, dissecting morality, calling upon ancient philosophers, have they managed to find any common ground?
You know, it's funny because it's not really about finding common ground in this case. It's more about recognizing that when it comes to these big questions about God, faith, the meaning of life, well, there aren't always easy answers.
Some debates you just can't win.
Exactly. Two people can look at the same evidence, the same set of facts, and walk away with completely different interpretations. And that's okay.
It's about respecting those different perspectives, even if you don't agree with them.
Absolutely. And that's what we really wanted to highlight in this deep dive. We didn't set out to tell you what to believe or give you a definitive answer about whether God exists or not.
We just wanted to present a fascinating conversation, a clash of ideas, and give you some things to ponder.
Because at the end of the day, these are questions we all grapple with. And the answers, well, those are deeply personal. They're shaped by your own experiences, your values, your own unique journey. So what resonated most with you? What will you be thinking about long after this deep dive is over? Keep those questions alive and keep searching for your own answers.